Objection number 5. IP brings up Genesis 4:23 through 26. Quote, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord and by his fierce anger. Now, before we get to the claim, let's just reference or emphasize rather the point, which is right here. He says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. Okay, so this is what IP is going to be referencing. Here's his claim. Jeremiah uses language from Genesis 1 in reverse to communicate the destruction of northern Israel, i.e., without form and void. Therefore, we can conclude Genesis 1 is, or at least may be, doing the same, that is to say, using this language to communicate destruction rather than to say there is nothing there and has never been anything there. God then is not creating the world in these passages, rather he is simply ordering that which is disordered, and thus ends the claim. Here are my objections. The scripture exhausts the language to communicate God's ex nihilo creation of all things. He creates the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Light, Genesis 1:3. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. Day and night, Genesis 1:4 through 5. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. Sky, Genesis 1:6 through 7. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. Land and seas, Genesis 1:9 through 10. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. Plants, Genesis 1:11. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit seed yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. Next we have sun, moon, and stars, Genesis 1:14. And God said, let there be, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the night from the day, from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. We also see animals, Genesis 1:21 and 25. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Next we have verse 25. That was verse 21. I said through, but it's actually verse 21 and verse 25. So here's verse 25. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good, end quote. Next, we see mankind, Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. So again, it is exhaustive. God creates absolutely everything, and he creates it out of nothing. In other words, put simply, it is not possible that Moses means to communicate what IP claims he means to communicate. And that is, of course, if IP even agrees with us that Moses wrote the Torah. I'm not 100% sure about that. I know he did, at least, at one point in time. But I don't know if he still does. Anyways. Now, to be clear, the prophet definitely does seem to be intentionally evoking pre-creation imagery in this passage. I don't dispute with IP on that point. The language he uses, without form and void, is identical to the language Moses uses in the first chapter of Genesis. In the Hebrew, it is tohu ha-Vahu, and it is, as you can see here, without form and void, or you can say formless and void. To describe Earth, he uses this exact language, tohu ha-Vahu, to describe Earth after its initial creation. However, it is likely not because Jeremiah believes Moses to be describing a destroyed land, a la Israel after the Assyrian conquest. Instead, I believe it is much more likely that Jeremiah is using a poetic exaggeration to describe the destroyed Israel as if it were uncreated, or you might even say reverse created, by which I mean brought to a state of non-existence as it was before it had ever existed. Think of that parental gem that I'm sure you all have heard. That is, quote, I brought you into this world and I can take you out of it, end quote. Now, here's my question. Is the mother speaking these words, claiming that she will turn you into an embryo or a fetus? Or is she claiming that the beating she's about to give you is something that is analogous to before you were born? In both cases, obviously not. Rather, she's evoking the imagery of non existence to compare your preborn state to your post mortem state. Rather darkly, I might add. Thanks, Mom. Further still, it must be noted that the earliest extant rabbis who wrote on this phrase were ubiquitous in their belief that it spoke of creation ex nihilo. See Genesis Rabbah 1:14 and 2:24, which were written between the years 300 and 500 AD, which, by the way, I'd just like to point out, is 200 to 400 years after Revelation is written, let alone the hundreds of years since Jeremiah was written. Jeremiah would be writing in the 500s, about 6th century BC. So we're talking potentially as much as 1,000 years after. In the case of Moses, if you take the early date of the Exodus, would be writing around the 1400s BC. So we're talking like 1,900 years in the future. And we don't see any rabbis writing on this idea, writing on the idea that Tohu Vahu is describing something other than creation ex nihilo until after the Genesis Rabbah is writing in the 500s AD. That's a very, very, very long time, I might add. It also happens to be a time that is post-Gnostic, which is important because the Gnostics, unfortunately, had a good deal of influence both on early Christians and on early Jews. Late early, if that makes sense. It's a little bit of an oxymoron, but obviously we're not talking about early guys. But I mean, clearly we can see with the acceptance of the Marian dogmas and stuff like that, or with the idea that we find sometimes in Talmud, that there was a second wife of Adam, or excuse me, a first wife, that Eve is the second wife, right? With those examples, we can see that around the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries AD, there certainly is influence from the Gnostics bleeding into Judaic circles and into Orthodox Christian circles. There's no doubt about that, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that, right? Which is why it's important that we don't see people referencing this argument that IP is making until after that point, because it means that it's at least theoretically possible they could be influenced by Gnostics. And by the way, guess who had the idea of pre-existent matter? Only the Gnostics. They're the only ones who had that idea. And in the modern day, the only ones who have that idea are the Mormons, which are, funnily enough, pretty much modern Gnostics. Now, am I claiming that guilt by association, this means that IP is a Mormon? No, I'm not. I'm not claiming it means he's a Gnostic either. I'm simply saying that when we can see clear influence from Gnostics in Christian circles around this time, and again, I reference the pre-existent wife of Adam that is not Eve, and again, I reference the Marian dogmas and so on and so forth, right? When we can see the influence of Gnostics in otherwise Orthodox Christian circles and Orthodox Judaic circles around the same time that we start to see this idea that was found only in the Gnostics, it's at least worth considering that this idea is a carryover from Gnosticism, right? And I think that it's not only theoretically